It's a pleasure to introduce my friend Aurelian Craiutu. I have a lot of stories about him, but I can't tell you those stories because he has a lot of stories about me, so we'll just leave that aside. He graduated from with a PhD in political theory from Princeton and actually successfully studied with George Kakev, which is almost never done. It's not possible. So to have finished with a premier scholar in political theory, he a lot of his early work was on French political theory. He then decided to give up on France and study moderation. But now his French roots are coming back. He wants to study radical moderation. And his question is that an oxymoron? So please join me in giving a big Duke welcome to Aurelian Craiutu.
Good evening, or good afternoon. I'm not sure exactly what I should be saying. First, thanks to my hosts here, the Center for the History of Political Economy, Professor Bruce Caldwell, Professor Mike Munger, all good friends. What Professor Munger forgot to mention is that Duke was my first post-graduation job. I had a beautiful office in Perkins Library here, which is no longer the site of the political science department, and I have very fond memories of this place. So some of you may not even have been born when I was teaching here, but I have good memories of that, so I'm very delighted to be back, I should say, home. Today's topic is a kind of oxymoron itself, radical moderation. And I distributed a handout which gives you a sense of what I'm going to cover. There are 6 points there, and then there are some quotes on the back, page number 2. I'm going to refer back and forth to those quotes. Some of them are interesting, some less so, but they are part of a story that I want to share with you. So without further ado, I would like to begin by saying that it may be counterintuitive to speak about moderation today as we are entering a new electoral campaign, electoral cycle today. The temperature of the political game, do I need to tell you, is very high again. As the recent speech given by President Biden in Philadelphia last week has shown, the stakes seem higher than ever. Democracy is at stake. The future of democracy is in question, President Biden said. I'm not sure he was entirely right. I hope he was wrong in many respects. But I would like to start with a very simple question today. Who needs moderation today when the stakes are so high, when democracy is in danger, when your future, your generation has to fight for the future of democracy? So when asking this question, who needs moderation today, I'm instantly reminded of Barry Goldwater's famous words from 6 decades ago. He said those words in the Republican convention in San Francisco in 1964. I wasn't even born then, but those words are memorable. They appear on the handout number 1 on the back page. Extremism in the pursuit of liberty, Goldwater said, is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice. At first sight, the present moment does not seem to be ripe for the moderation any more than the 60s, the period when Goldwater said those words were. I forgot to mention that he lost big time in the presidential elections after uttering those words to LBJ. Today we live in bubbles and echo chambers as thick as ever. And democratic norms are being undermined by politicians, elected ones, I should say, who exhibit an insatiable appetite for power and media coverage. Writing about moderation or trying to practice this virtue, even worse, imagine trying to practice this virtue, seems to be a self-defeating course of action. But is this really the case? As someone who has been researching this elusive virtue for some time, I'm known for having pursued immoderately the virtue of moderation in academia. I've learned several important things about it, and I'd like to share with you today. First, this virtue never makes the headlines in our cable news world. 24/7, you turn on the TV, you never hear what the moderates have said. Maybe you hear something about Joe Manchin, but whether he's a moderate or not, I leave it to you to decide. It is conspicuously absent from the agenda of the majority of our politicians and parties and pundits on TV. We know for sure who the lions and the foxes are, that is those who use force, incite to violence, or lie to achieve their goals. But the moderates, those who are neither foxes nor lions, rarely appear on our radar screens. If you turn on the TV, the word moderation never appears. That's why I think writing about moderation is a niche affair, a very small niche, that amounts often to a silent condemnation to marginality and solitude. But it's a good solitude, I should say, because it brings me to lectures like this, and I get to meet intelligent young people like you. So that is, I think, one of the benefits of moderation that I'll be talking about later. The second thing I've learned is that moderation represents an entire tradition of thought that transcends, and I want to emphasize this, transcends our classical categories of left, right, socialism, capitalism. This elusive virtue forms what I would call an entire archipelago that has yet to be fully explored, and certainly no single person can fully explore the archipelago of moderation. Third, studying this tradition of political moderation led me to the conclusion that the conventional image of moderation as a weak and ineffective virtue deserves to be challenged and revised thoroughly, not just revised. This is the lesson of Edmund Burke, who warned us, and this is the second quote on the handout on the back, who warned us 2 centuries ago that moderation has often been stigmatized as the virtue of cowards and compromise as the prudence of traitors. And yet, he still regarded moderation as the virtue of noble and superior minds, a powerful and cementing virtue indispensable to any public official. Anyone who wants to exercise power ought to have a degree, a modicum of moderation, Burke believed. So now let's be honest for a moment and admit that Burke's defense of moderation seems very alien to all of us today. In the age of Brexit, in the age of Putin, Ukraine war, and the age of Trump. Why is this the case? I ask myself, and I ask you. I invite you to find the answer. Wasn't John Adams right when he admitted, and this is the 4th quote on the handout, that without moderation, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey? Wasn't he right when he said this? If so, why is it the case that moderates have become a sort of endangered species today, in dire need of protection? We need a new environmental act to save moderates from extinction today. Can we do something to save them from extinction besides putting them on the endangered species list? Well, there's no secret that moderation has an image problem in our world of fake news and alternative facts. Many of those who run for office today in a climate dominated by hyperbole and ideological intransigence, my way or the highway, have been and still are keen to distinguish themselves from the few, very few, willing to work across party lines to strike reasonable and timely compromises with their political opponents. Moderates, do I need to remind you, have been the victims of gerrymandering in many states and public insults in every state. They have been challenged in primaries by opponents who campaigned by stressing political purity and litmus tests to the core. No wonder then that moderation carries the connotation of weakness, timidity, and indecisiveness. This is how moderates are seen by many. If you are called a moderate, it means that you are a weak person, timid, indecisive. On this view, with which I disagree, moderation is practiced only by weak individuals unable to hold firm opinions and make strong decisions. If you are a wishy-washy person, a flip-flopper, then you are a moderate. That is the wrong view, and as I will try to demonstrate tonight. Others equate moderation with opportunism or see it as a synonym of mediocrity and pettiness. According to this view, moderates lack moral principles. They are merely opportunists. They follow the winds, the changes of fortuna, the luck or the bad luck. They are willing to endorse dubious compromises to advance their agendas, and they defend, in the end, an unsavory center devoid of substance. If you are in a center, It's okay, but it's devoid of substance. That's the other image of moderation. The idea is that if one is brave enough to believe in something, the argument goes, one cannot be and should not be a moderate. And this is what Rush Limbaugh, a very prominent American radio host, proclaimed. This is number 5 on the handout. I like to give this quote because it is, I think, indicative of the dislike of moderation in many circles. By definition, moderates can't be brave. They don't have opinion. Brave moderates, question mark. Great moderates in American history, question mark. Show me the book. And yet another view is that moderation can never be truly radical or democratic enough because it lacks a clear moral and political compass. According to this critique, moderation amounts in practice to endorsing the status quo or condoning various forms of injustice. Those who embrace such a view of moderation do not really care about addressing social justice issues or inequalities. And there is, I think, a famous critique along these lines put forward by Martin Luther King Jr. in his famous letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963, in which he denounced the moderation of the white man, with good reasons at the time. So all of these critiques have a grain of truth in them, because this is how we came to associate moderation with all of these images. It is indeed difficult, and I want to point it out from the very outset, it is difficult to be enthusiastic about a virtue which seems to lack charisma, carries the connotation of small-mindedness and Philistine dullness. And yet I believe that all of these critiques, with the exception of Martin Luther King Jr.'s, are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of moderation, which is a complex virtue with many faces, not just one faces, many faces. So how so, you might ask? So let me try to answer this question. First, I think it's important to point out that this virtue is an old concept. I haven't invented it, and I'm not the first one nor the last one to work on it. An old concept with deep roots in classical political thought, in ancient political thought, Greek and Roman, and the Jewish tradition, but also in various religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Confucianism as well. Enlightened minds from the past, from Plato, Aristotle, Tacitus, and Cicero to Montaigne, Montesquieu, James Madison, Burke, and Tocqueville, saw something valuable in moderation that present critics seem to miss. Tacitus, for example, called moderation, quote, the most difficult lesson of wisdom, while Montesquieu praised it as, quote, the supreme virtue of legislators. The word moderation appears many times in the Federalist Papers, over 11 times, and played a key role in George Washington's famous farewell address. If you haven't read the farewell address, I strongly encourage you to do so, because you'll see that there our first president regarded moderation as a pillar of the republic and a sign of power rather than weakness or opportunism. American democracy, George Washington cautioned us, may be fatally weakened if we allow immoderation, what he called ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, to dominate the political scene, opening the door to, again, quote, foreign influence and corruption. This was in 1796. What all these authors teach us, I think, is that moderation is much more than a simple trait of character. We usually say someone is a moderate, and we assume that moderation is an ethical trait. But there's more than that. There's more than a certain state of mind or a disposition. In addition to its ethical meaning that we can find in the works of Aristotle, for example, or Cicero, it also has distinctively political and institutional and constitutional dimension. Moderation represents also a certain style, a certain ethos of political action and agenda. A certain style is important to highlight what that style is all about, and I will try to do so later. The ethical side of moderation can be found in the famous golden mean of the ancients, as described, for example, again by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, though it comes from Horace. The institutional, constitutional component of moderation is illustrated by the concept of moderate government in the writings of Montesquieu, in the Spirit of the Laws, and the Federalist Papers. Moderate governments are those that seek to place power in different hands, separate those hands, and in such a way that they cannot abuse the power that is placed in them. Moderate governments seek to achieve a balance between various ideas, interests, groups in society, a balance that can offer an effective way of ruling, of governing in divided societies without violence. What the critics of moderation ignore is that it is a difficult virtue and a risky one that presupposes many things. Let me explain what I think moderation involves here. It requires first and foremost courage. It may be surprising to put courage at the very top of the list, but I think it's appropriate to do so. It's the courage to swim against the current, the courage to say no when the masses say yes. In many respects, moderates are similar to brave tightrope walkers, the funambulists, who must always be extremely careful to maintain their balance and sense of direction in order to avoid falling. I don't presume anyone here has been on a wire up there trying to walk on a thin wire. Has anyone been up there? I have not. And I don't encourage you to do so. Why? Because it takes a lot of stuff to be there. It takes, first of all, training. You can't just be a tightrope walker just because you want to be one. You need to train for that. You need a sense of balance, equilibrium. You need also something else. What do you need? You need a sense of intuition. You need an intuition. You need to figure out where the wind blows so you can kind of foresee that and you lean in the opposite direction. It also takes a little bit of art. If you look at the tightrope walkers, and the cover of my previous book features a tightrope walker, that's why I like this image, they are kind of a bit of an artist. There is no algorithm for staying on a wire. You have to figure out, when to lean one side, when to lean to the other one, and you need to be a little bit of an artist and kind of enjoy the moment. You need the intuition as well. Moderation is difficult for all of these reasons, but there's another reason for which it is a difficult virtue. It defies universal claims and moral absolutes. We like to imagine in ethics that a virtue has to be universal and has to be linked to a moral absolute. But no, I think in this case we have a virtue that defies universal claims and absolutes, and it lacks a precise algorithm which could be applied indiscriminately to all situations. Moreover, and this is a little bit of a paradox of moderation, it requires the knowledge of knowing when not to be a moderate, because there are moments when it is appropriate to leave moderation at the door and act in a bold, maybe immoderate manner. As such, moderation is a peculiar virtue that is neither a virtue for everyone, and I don't expect to convince you that you should be, all of you, a moderate, and it is not for all seasons. What is moderate in one context, moreover, what was moderate, for example, in the 1930s may no longer be moderate today, and what is moderate today may no longer be moderate 20 years from now. Far from being a synonym of soft-mindedness, timidity and hesitation, or opportunism, as I said earlier, this type of moderation is a fighting and a non-conformist virtue that refuses the litmus tests of ideological purity and opposes zealotry and fanaticism in all their forms. It is a strong and energetic form of moderation that thrives on partisanship, doesn't shy away from partisanship, thrives on partisanship, and does not search for a cozy political consensus on divisive issues. It's not always good to be in the center. You have to be on one side or the other. It radiates openness and generosity towards others, including one's political opponents, and refuses to practice political vendettas for the sake of gaining and consolidating political power. Now, you may still think that these are two general terms to describe a complex virtue like this one. So I'd like to speak next about what moderates stand for, which is another way for me to talk about the many faces of moderation. So the question that I'd like to take up is, what is the mentality of those who put moderation first? Because there are such people. I think that moderates share a steady preoccupation with political evil, broadly defined, and seek to avoid the extremes of cruelty, anarchy, and civil war. when there is a civil war looming in the horizon, on the horizon, then moderates go into alert mode. They tend to keep the dialogue, the lines of dialogue open with their political opponents when this is possible, in order to preserve the fundamental values of their political communities. This is not easy, but they do it by rejecting an all or nothing approach, which is my way or the highway, and always keep an open mind, accepting new evidence, which may be brought to bear on old topics, and considering arguments on all sides, including, or first and foremost, from their opponents. In other words, moderates do not see the world in Manichaean terms, black or white, the children of light versus the children of evil. They do not divide the world into axes of evil, forces of light or forces of darkness. They refuse, moreover, the posture of prophets, champion sobriety in political thinking and action, and endorse an ethic of responsibility as opposed to an ethics of absolute ends, to take up the metaphor proposed by Max Weber. Sometimes this involves significant risks and costs, and they are willing to take up those risks. So if we are looking for a single word, I think, to characterize the various phases of political moderation, I would say that moderates can be described as trimmers, concerned with preserving the balance of the ship of the state on an even keel. Trimming is a nautical metaphor. You trim the sails of a ship to keep the ship from capsizing. It's not easy to do it. Again, I'm better at talking about it than doing it. But this doesn't prevent me from illustrating my examples with this metaphor that was coined by a 17th century English writer, the Marquis of Halifax. And this is the 8th quotation on the back of my handout. And this is what Halifax wrote in 1684 in a beautiful essay called The Character of a Trimmer. This innocent word, trimmer, Halifax wrote, signifies no more than this, that if men are together in a boat, and one part of company would weigh it down on one side, another would make it lean as much as to the contrary. It happens that there is a third opinion of those who conceive it would do well if the boat went even without endangering the passengers. It's a beautiful metaphor, trimming, but it's a difficult thing to do because you need to be willing to lean one side or to another. You must also read the signs of the time to know which side you need to support. But political trimming is not easy. It requires a great deal of courage and demands also a certain vision. You want to know where you want to, what's the final destination you want to reach. You just cannot be at sea forever. You are sailing for a particular port. You are sailing to a particular port. And it requires audacity and firmness, and as well as a certain vision of the final destination. And that's why this final destination is always an open-ended subject for moderates. I prefer to define it in the terms of the concept of open society, which was a term initially proposed by a French philosopher, Henri Bergson, and popularized by Karl Popper in his book, Open Society and Its Enemies. The open society is the final end for the moderates. Not only, but the moderates are committed to the principles of modern society. And they are committed to restoring the equilibrium in any society that seems to depart from the principles of the open society. And to that effect, moderates tend to adopt some of the soundest attitudes and principles of all parties. They tend to adopt some of the soundest principles of all parties, and they are willing to work hard to facilitate agreements between them in order to calm passions, reduce the temperature of the political game, and heal wounds between opponents. In other words, they seek to protect the balance between diverse social and political forces on which political pluralism, social order, and freedom depend in modern society. And this balance is at the heart of what Montesquieu called, in the spirit of the laws, moderate government. As I mentioned earlier, moderate governments, he thought, were to be distinguished from immoderate governments. This was the dichotomy that he worked with in the spirit of the laws. Moderate governments for him are intrinsically complex governments and depend on a judicious balance and distribution of powers, a healthy type of pluralism, and an effective combination of interests of various groups in society, the rich, the poor. Moderate governments, in other words, are not the work of nature. They do not spring up from the soil naturally, but they are a work of art, legislators, and skillful institutional design. Now, moderate governments may take various institutional forms, which explains why moderation has many faces related to each other. In practice, as I mentioned earlier, moderation may sometimes amount to finding a center, though I do not like too much to talk about the center in relation to moderation. I prefer to talk about a neutral power above all powers, above the fray. Something like a constitutional monarch, if you wish, in the scheme of constitutional monarchy, and in the United States, up until recently, I would say, the Supreme Court, that played that role of a power above the fray. Sometimes the middle of the road can be the dead center. And we've seen examples in history where the center was the dead center, a stillborn center from the day one. So while it may be tempting to equate centrism with moderation, it is important at the same time to acknowledge that moderates can exist on all sides of the political spectrum, on the left, in the center, and on the right of the political aisle, on all of them. And this is something that I've come to appreciate and understand as I was writing about the concept of moderation. In other words, moderation is not necessarily a conservative virtue as it is presented sometimes in the media. Not necessarily, although moderates know very well that conservative ideas may be necessary and are necessary in some respects in order to balance the ship of the state. But they cannot offer, the conservative ideas alone, moderates believe, cannot offer an alternative to the direction in which we are moving. Moderates do not fear change, they do not fear new ideas, and they do not profess a particular fondness for authority, which I take to be a hallmark of conservatism. Instead, I would prefer to define moderation as an eclectic virtue. Eclectic virtue, complex, mixed, made of different faces. So this explains, in my understanding, why moderates are wearing and have worn various masks over time. The list of these masks is long, and let me share with you a few of them to give you a sense of the complexity of the archipelago of moderation that I'm talking about. The Stoic, in the works of Seneca, for example, there is an element of moderation in the philosophy of Seneca. The prudent man or woman, in the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, Guicciardini, and my favorite of all, the 17th century Spanish Jesuit writer Baltasar Gracián, who wrote the book about prudence, called the Oráculo Manual y Arte de la Prudencia, the manual oracle and the art of prudence. The trimmer that I've talked earlier in the works of Halifax, more closer to our times, Michael Oakeshott. The skeptic in the works of David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Michel de Montaigne. The pluralist in the works of James Madison and closer to us, Isaiah Berlin. The individual above the fray, and that is the image of George Washington in the Farewell Address. The critic of zealotry and fanaticism, this is Edmund Burke. The eclectic, the philosopher Victor Cousin in 19th century France. And in the 20th century France, the committed observer, le spectateur engagé in the works of Raymond Aron. Now, these are the masks, the faces of moderation, but there are concrete examples of moderate agendas that I would also like to propose to your consideration. There are many of them, and I could mention here the juste milieu, the middle-of-the-road doctrine between revolution and reaction in 19th century France, the doctrine of ordo liberalism that was instrumental in creating the social market economy, the soziale Marktwirtschaft in 20th century Germany, social democracy and the New Deal as a middle ground between pure free market socialism, capitalism, and full state socialism. And there were also political movements that have claimed to follow principles of moderation. A couple of them, more than a couple. The Prague Spring Movement of 1968. As the students were protesting in Paris in 1968, there were other students protesting in Prague against the Soviet invasion in 1968. And the French-Czech famous novelist Milan Kundera called them a revolt of the moderates. The Solidarity movement and the self-limiting revolution in communist Poland in 1970s and 1980s that were instrumental in bringing down communism in Eastern Europe were movements characterized by political moderation. Think about this term, self-limiting revolution. This is a term coined by a sociologist, Jadwiga Staniskis, and taken up by the Polish dissident and political thinker Adam Michnik. The Charter 77 in the former Czechoslovakia, inspired by a rock band, the Plastic People of the Universe, which you probably had never heard of, but you probably have heard of the works of the former Czech president Václav Havel. There is an element of moderation there. And the doctrine of the third way in the United Kingdom in the 1990s under the leadership of the former Prime Minister Tony Blair. So these are some concrete examples of moderate agendas. And they all have certain benefits. So I cannot explain here in a short amount of time what all of these movements have in common. I can only make a simple claim that most of them defend moderation or invoke moderation because there are some advantages. So let me highlight a few of them. First and foremost, as I understand it, the greatest advantage of moderation is that it is not an ideology with fixed contours. People in your generation today like ideologies. You are energized, politically engaged. You want to claim to be on the left, on the right, and that's good. Go for it and do your good work. Moderation does not offer you that. It doesn't offer you an ideology with fixed contours. It has affinities with different political tradition, but it is heterogeneous. And I think because of its heterogeneity, the fact that it's both left and right and center, it can accommodate a wide range of political ideas, views, and forms. And this flexibility, arguably, in my view, constitutes one of its greatest benefits because it allows moderates to get things done while others, more committed to abstract principles of a certain political persuasion, fail to do so. And I think this is a great advantage. There's a second advantage that I'd like to share with you. And moderation can be successful, and it is successful at times because it allows us to think politically rather than ideologically. Moderates believe that having political opinions is not a matter of embracing an ideology, a doctrine, a dogma once and for all. It is simply a question of being able to make sensible decisions in changing circumstances. When facts change, John Maynard Keynes was asked, what do? You change your mind. As such, moderation is often an effective means for promoting significant economic and political and constitutional change that challenges the status quo rather than consolidates it, as people assume. Consider, for example, for a moment, the career of Abraham Lincoln, another moderate that I want to invoke tonight, whose example shows the radical as well as the realistic side of moderation. Moderates like Lincoln start by looking at the world as is, not as it should be. And they don't use a veil of ignorance to figure out what would be just to achieve in certain circumstances. They think politically, that is, they choose the lesser evil rather than seeking for the perfect ideal outcome. They understand that most often the best we can do is to maintain a precarious equilibrium that can prevent the occurrence of tragic situation. That is the first requirement of a decent society. So there's this concept of decent society that is at the heart of what moderates stand for. So let me ask a related question. So what does it really mean to think politically? Is there something substantial here, or is it just a dispositional thing? I think those who think politically rather than ideologically refuse to define one single best way. There is no panacea for them. In other words, political good is multi-dimensional. Sometimes it can be the state, more state. Sometimes it can be more market. Sometimes it can be organizations at the local level. This was the lesson taught by my former colleague, the late political scientist Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009. She demonstrated that there is no single blueprint, there is no panacea. Sometimes it's a little bit more market, sometimes a little bit more state, sometimes a little bit more associational work to do. So moderates are against perfectionism, and they advocate piecemeal reforms. Panaceas do not exist on their list. There's no absolute blueprint, no final synthesis on their list either. The best moderates can achieve is a fragile balance again, and pluralism of ideas and interests. And this is the third benefit of moderation. When you are committed to this worldview, that there is no single best way, you are likely to adopt a flexible and skeptical mindset, which is the opposite of fanaticism and dogmatism. If you look around today, you open the social media channels, you find fanatical attitudes on all sides. A lot of fanaticism permeates our social media today. This mindset opposes that. It makes us able to correct mistakes, to say, honestly, admit, we made a mistake, we don't know. We may do this, but we may do that. And it makes us able to engage in trade-offs between different values and principles. Trade-offs are good. Gray can be beautiful. We do have the right to hesitate, in other words, to compare, to balance, in accordance with our limited knowledge and fallibility, which is a fundamental principle of moderation, fallibility. So such a anti-perfectionist, pragmatic, moderate position can be found in for example, in the attitude of Benjamin Franklin. And this is the 7th quote on the back of my handout. You probably know this. When he was asked what he thought about the US Constitution about to be ratified in Philadelphia in 1787, he said this. This is a beautiful passage that gives us a sense of how moderates think. I doubt too whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution, for when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with these men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. Thus I consent, sir, to this constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that this is not the best. I'm not sure this is not the best. Now, there's another advantage, two other advantages of moderation that I would briefly invoke here. Moderation promotes civility and compromise, two values that undergird the functioning of our institutions. Moderation makes our minds simultaneously firm and flexible, and makes us immune to any type of crusading mentality. Many of us today are or feel engaged in a crusade to do something, to defeat their opponents, to promote a certain value or something. But it is the crusading mentality that moderates are skeptical of, and this is exactly what they seek to avoid in their political activities. So there's one other advantage. Moderates are rarely self-righteous, and they practice humility and self-restraint. I do not like self-righteous people who always have the holier-than-thou attitude. Let me tell you how things are. Moderates never do that, and they are aware that political life and social interaction is a kind of an art of conversation. Your generation doesn't have much knowledge about the art of conversation, neither mine, to be honest. It requires a talent for speaking, for listening, for keeping silent at times, a good sense of irony, courtesy, and a good playful attitude. And moderates have all of that. One final point here before I move on to my conclusion. Moderates are opposed to monologues, bubbles, and echo chambers, and we have plenty of them in our society today. Their motto, if there is one, is may the other herd be also heard. May the other side be also heard. They demand that dissenting voices be given a chance to make up their case. They are against cancel culture, if you allow me to use this rather compromising and compromised term. For them, the world is a vast school of inquiry. We need to listen. We need to make our voices heard. We need to listen others as well. So it is time to conclude and return to my initial question. Who needs moderation today? Perhaps in light of what I've been trying to say today, I would like to rephrase this question: what kind of moderation we may need today in our hyper-polarized and very restless world? So the spirit of moderation that I referred to earlier, the ethos, is not hard to define. To paraphrase Judge Learned Hand, and this is the 10th and last quote on my handout, I would say that the spirit of moderation is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of moderation is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of those men and women with whom we are engaged in a social conversation. The spirit of moderation is the spirit which weighs their interests along ours without bias and prejudice. What we know for sure, it is not the spirit of the false moderation of the white man denounced by Martin Luther King Jr. in the letter from the Birmingham jail. That is something that we can no longer accept and we do not need. What we need is a muscular form of moderation, is a radical form of moderation that does not search or condone safe spaces and lukewarm solutions. Again, the world is a vast school of inquiry, and we need to learn, and moderates teach us how to affirm our opinions boldly, firmly, and with civility, while opposing all forms of fanaticism and dogmatism. Moderates teach us how to refrain from attacking persons. We need to engage with their ideas, not with persons. We need to learn how to refrain from issuing prescriptions, enforcing litmus tests, and we should never condone any form of violence, period. In other words, moderates teach us how not to see the world, which is not to see the world in us versus them terms, Manichaean terms, black and white, dark and light. So I'd like to end by offering a few reasons for optimism, because there aren't that many these days. As we approach a new electoral cycle, those of you with an interest in politics may ask, what are we to do? 5 decades ago, Sol Alinsky, a famous community activist from Chicago, published a pragmatic primer for realistic radicals. It's a great book, still in print. It was a passionate counsel on how to bring about social change in a very turbulent age. And I want to remind you that the 60s were much more turbulent than our age today. There were lots of assassinations then. There was lots of violence. Rules for Radicals was his book, became an instant bestseller and influenced generations of community activists. So I would like to ask you, I'll ask myself first, what would be the rules for realistic and pragmatic moderates look like, if there are such rules? It's a little bit counterintuitive to end with rules for moderates, but let's try to figure out some of them. Rule number 1, refuse to define one single best way. Do not have fixed truth or dogmas when it comes to politics. Instead, examine facts, do your homework, and be prepared to amend and nuance your beliefs when facts change. Again, John Maynard Keynes, what do you do, sir, when facts change? You change your mind. Rule number 2, avoid echo chambers and bubbles, and do not be sectarian in defending your views. Defend your views, but do not be sectarians. Do not put your tribe above your country. Always try to think politically rather than ideologically as much as you can. Keep the lines open with your opponents, even when that may be uncomfortable, difficult, and risky, politically and personally. The benefits of doing so will always outweigh the costs in the long term. Rule number 3, do not be a perfectionist. Start working with the world as is, not as it should be. Defend piecemeal reforms, step by step, rather than endorsing utopian blueprints for change. Remember that the world is made of many shades of gray, 50 shades of gray, maybe less, and gray too sometimes can be beautiful. I don't know how many, but there are more than one. Rule number 4, do not become obsessed with purity tests, axis of evil, red lines, or litmus tests. Resist the temptation to divide the universe between the forces of the good and the forces of evil, because you may never know which side you may end up on. And rule number 5, and the last one, no particular belief should hurt you in political life. If you decide to enter political life, public life, and I hope you will, some of you will do, be prepared. Have a thick skin. Admit that most political issues will have more than one side, and as a result, resist the temptation to interpret the events, the world around you, in light of one single principle, such as, and I'll give a few examples here at the risk of becoming sectarian here, pro-life or pro-choice, New Green Deal or no deal, lower taxes or higher taxes, Second Amendment for or against. Be prepared to make reasonable adjustments and compromises for the sake of piecemeal reforms. So, I should like to end by quoting the words of a courageous intellectual whom I admire, who was a moderate, and who should be on your reading list. If you haven't read him, it's time to do so. This is Albert Camus. For Camus, who wrote in the first half of the 20th century, he died in 1960, moderation defined as a sense of measure and proportions entailed great tension and risks. And this is really the last quote, it's number 9 on the handout. His defined moderation was supposed to be in the service of justice. It was a virtue proper to burning hearts, as he says. He insisted on using, and this is what we should all be doing, plain language and clear ideas, so as not to increase the world of lies, the world of fake news and alternative facts. And he managed to live up to his task. Camus thought that our world does not need tepid and lukewarm souls. Instead, it needs burning and passionate hearts, men and women who know, he wrote, the place of moderation. To him, moderation was a source of strength, like it was for George Washington, not weakness. It was the guiding principle of good government and, yes, decent society. Maybe not the just society, but good enough, decent society. That is better than civil war. This was in 1944, as France was trying to come to terms with the collaboration with the fascists and trying to emerge from the war. Does his message still hold true today, when we face new challenges that threaten our own free way of life? So I think there is no better way of ending this lecture for me than to invite each of you to find an answer to Camus' question on your own. So you'll know better than me what the answer is. Thank you for your attention. I don't expect agreement, so I would like to have the opportunity to answer some questions and maybe see how I face up to what I profess to be a moderation here. Thank you for your questions. So I'm going to try to take 2 questions at a time, if that's okay. The third one I always forget, okay? So let me start with your question here. As I said, and this is right on the mark, there are moments when it's not appropriate to be a moderate. And the Weimar Republic is an example of that. And I think that we may be reaching a point where we need to stand firm for what we think are essential pillars, non-compromisable, of what we call a decent and a free society. So, for example, the integrity of elections. Anyone who tinkers with the integrity of the right to vote, tries to restrict it, we cannot accept that. So there are values for which one has to be immoderate in defending. I usually give the example of the former Soviet writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn fought against the communist regime in former Soviet Union in an immoderate way. There was also a moderate way of fighting against communism that was represented by the former dissident physicist Andrei Sakharov, who focused on individual rights, human rights. But Solzhenitsyn was never a moderate, and he was successful. So there are such moments when you have to draw the line. And I think Lincoln himself is an interesting example, because Lincoln suspended the habeas corpus. And he understood that to save the Union, he needed to do that. He was a Whig, so he was a moderate of sorts, and he professed a commitment to moderation in his eulogy of Henry Clay. The political thing is interesting. So when I make this distinction between thinking politically and thinking ideologically, I always ask myself, what would I do if I were in the shoes of a statesperson, stateswoman, statesman, who is supposed to make a decision. So I always try to see the decision from bottom up rather than top down. So I try to put myself in the shoes of that person. Because to think politically, I think you need to take into account all of the considerations that are brought to bear on a particular topic. Doing your homework, trying to see the different sides of the argument. That is what I think thinking politically implies. If you are committed to a certain ideological viewpoint, you would immediately know the answer before the question is asked. Or I think thinking politically requires someone first to figure out what the question is, what are the data on the ground. And that is different from thinking ideologically. On all of those issues that I end up with, pro-life, pro-choice, Second Amendment, lower taxes, and whatever, healthcare, people have very quick answers, shortcuts, based on the ideological proclivities. I have mine, to be honest. I haven't done my work studying the tax code. Nobody has. Not even Professor Munger here, I suppose, hasn't read the US tax code. But we have to rely on shortcuts, on experts, on ideological considerations. Those are difficult cases, but the more we try to ascertain the facts, the better, I think. And this temptation to simplify the world is the temptation of ideologies. And it's easy. The world is complicated. It has many windows, many colors, and many figures. There was a question there. So the way in which I understand this, and you may know more about this than me, I think the center is like the middle. It's geographically located, spatially restricted to a position. The differences between, if I may use this Aristotelian distinction, between the middle and the mean. The middle is clear. You can almost measure it with a ruler. The mean is always a matter of judgment. So sometimes the mean is a little bit to the left, sometimes the mean is a little bit to the right. It depends on circumstances. It depends on the configuration of the political scene, the demands of the moment, like the Weimar Republic, which is a very good example. So I think the moderates stand for searching for the mean rather than searching for the middle, which I would identify with the center. It doesn't mean that sometimes the mean is not in the center, but moderates can exist on the left, right, and the center of the political spectrum. And that's why I try to give example in my talk from all sides of the political spectrum. I don't know whether anyone of you noticed the irony of using Saul Alinsky in a talk about moderation, which is certainly a bit far-fetched on my part. But I did write about Saul Alinsky in a paper on moderation, and nobody objected. Probably nobody read it. But if you really read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, you see that there is a lot of overlap with a certain ethos of moderation, though Alinsky was not a moderate. Alinsky used foul language. He has some tactics that are far from moderate. But, I think there is an ethos there. Well, first of all, coming to talks like this, listening to people like me, maybe you get to learn something new. Maybe you get to read. There's a pantheon of moderation. There's an archipelago of moderation. So if anything you take from this lecture is the idea that there is a tradition of thought. It's not just one author or one inclination. There's a solid tradition of thought. So those enlightened minds knew something when they wrote about this, number one. But I would also look at examples of politicians, of thinkers that you admire. And I will give one example here just because I feel it's a good example. I admire the work and the career of a French thinker by the name Raymond Aron. I pronounced his name earlier. Aron was a sociologist. He was engaged in a lifelong engagement with Marxism. He was not a Marxist, but he knew Marx better than all of the Marxists in France because he studied Marx and he reached the conclusion that the economic theories of Marx were unsustainable. Aron practiced politics of civility. He engaged in a dialogue with Jean-Paul Sartre all the time. He was an eminently civil person. I feel inspired by people like that. So I encourage you to look him up on YouTube if you read French or learn a little bit of French. He speaks beautiful French, so you can practice your French on that. But those models are, I think, important. And there's a third lesson, if I may end up with this. I'm a child of the 20th century. I was born behind the Iron Curtain. I was on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, as I said. But I got my vaccine against totalitarianism by living under a totalitarian regime, immoderate regime. So experiences like that, the tragic failure of a political regime, like the Weimar Republic's demise, fascism, the election of Hitler through popular suffrage, all of these lessons of the 20th century, I think we need to keep our eyes open and learn something from that. And I think that's a lesson, an indirect lesson and an invitation to moderation. After the tragic failures of 20th century communism, it doesn't mean that you can't be a communist anymore, but you can't say that was an accidental error. You need to take up. The same with fascism. You can't say, well, it was Hitler's fault. If Hitler or Stalin hadn't existed. No, there are many Hitlers in the world, many Stalins in the world that can appear at any moment. So I guess history is a lesson, the examples, and the theories that I mentioned.